Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast about your Kindle books and all things Amazon. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is Thanksgiving in the U.S., November 22nd, 2018. Welcome to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and happy Thanksgiving from the land of the Pilgrims, who landed about 45 miles from here 398 years ago after a 2-month voyage aboard the Mayflower. There are lots of ways people here in New England honor their heritage. That's a good thing, mostly, but sometimes I will admit it overemphasizes origins and class, especially compared with the American West. When I moved from Providence, Rhode Island to Casper, Wyoming 37 years ago, I fell in love with the big sky and the indifference people in the cowboy state had to where you came from. Except that if you came from Harvard, you'd best keep that under your Stetson until you'd proven yourself to be otherwise trustworthy and normal. As for coming over on the Mayflower, I can't remember ever admitting that fact to my new friends in Casper. My father's side of the family actually does trace its genealogy back to Mayflower passengers Francis Cook and John Speak-for-Yourself Alden and his wife Priscilla. There were more than 100 passengers on the Mayflower when they left England, and after one death and one birth at sea, the same number when they reached the New World. They named the baby Oceanus. That reminds me that I have begun rereading Moby Dick thanks to the urging of last week's guest, Chris Schloop, and two of you who chimed in to praise that classic sea tale. I'm putting this episode up on Thanksgiving, a day early before we leave for Turkey at my nephew's home in Lincoln, and that's because Darlene and I will fly very early tomorrow morning to Tucson for a few days with her sister Deb, and then on to Denver. I'll be returning late next week. Mom and Dad, 89 and 91, are going to join us for today's family gathering. It's going to be the first not held under their own roof since any of us can remember. They're doing very well in their new home, which has already become the new center of our family, a busy place of visitors from 4 generations. For many of you, today will feature a traditional gathering of friends and family, and I hope you'll be able to settle deeply into the joy of connecting and eating with loved ones. I did promise Darlene I was going to have the show done before we leave for Lincoln, so I'm going to jump right into my interview with James McQuivey, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. It's been almost a year since we last heard from James on the show, so there was lots to catch up on. I recorded our conversation on November 19th, which happened to be the 11th anniversary of the introduction of the Kindle, so I began by asking James what he expected when he first heard about Amazon's new e-reader and what has surprised him the most in the 11 years since.
My first thought was, finally, this felt like an obvious decision for Amazon to get into. Now, understand that I had read my first ebook on a personal device in 1998. So I was 10 years ahead of this idea. And at the time I did it, it was really clunky and really hard. I was using a device called the Scion Series 3, which was a palm-top computer run on 2 AA batteries, but it was perfect for reading compared to other devices in the time. And I remember thinking, man, once someone comes up with a device that makes this convenient, not to mention the business model that enables it, that will be amazing. So I knew this was going to happen. I think when the Kindle itself came out, though, I had 2 very specific reactions. Number one, they designed it to look like it's part of a Cardassian warship. It had for the people, I'm sorry, anyone who doesn't know what a Cardassian is, that's from the Star Trek universe. It's not a mispronunciation of a popular reality TV show. But Cardassian design was deliberately, nothing was ever at right angles on purpose. It was part of the philosophy of the Cardassian alien race, according to its creators. And that was the same thing with this device. The first Kindle, which I ordered, and I still have the box because the box was actually quite elegant, it just looked like it had been designed in an alien way, and I don't think that was the right way to take it. And they very quickly, the next versions became more rounded, became more right angular, and became more focused on the screen itself rather than the alien-looking design. And of course, once you could ditch the keyboard, that changed everything completely. So that was my first reaction to it. They're going to need to change this design. The second thing that came to mind was Amazon loyalists are going to love this. And I had the data. So I went through our data on people who were Amazon customers. And I found about 5 million of them who were buying enough from Amazon and were buying books from Amazon and were reading a lot of books in their regular lives. And so that's people who read at least a book a month, which is a small section of the population, but it happens to be Amazon's core customer back in that era. And I knew there were about 5 million people who were going to want one of these things. So that was clear to me. What I did wrong, actually, and I published a report about the original Kindle to our clients. I assumed it would take maybe 5 years to get those 5 million customers. It took 3, and then other customers that weren't in my model were already starting to buy in that third year as well. And so that's where one of the really early indications to me that we were, not just for Amazon, but generally at a tipping point in consumer technology behavior, because it turned out to be true for the iPad in 2010, which sold 10 million units in 9 months. It turned out to be true for the Microsoft Xbox Kinect camera, which sold 10 million units in, I think, 3 months. So the Kindle was really the first thing that got to millions of customers much faster than history would have suggested. And it wasn't just because people liked to read. It was because as a population, we were shifting our attitudes towards new stuff. So I learned a lot from that experience.
I was looking back, January 2010, there was a weekend showdown between Macmillan and Amazon where Amazon deleted the buy buttons on the Macmillan books. And when it was all over, I think it only lasted 2 days, Amazon announced, "We want you to know that ultimately, however, we will have to capitulate and accept Macmillan's terms because Macmillan has a monopoly over their own titles, and we will want to offer them to you even at prices we believe are needlessly high for ebooks." So that was 8+ years ago.
Look who has the monopoly now.
Yeah, who won the showdown?
Yeah. Well, and really Amazon won. I mean, there are lots of types of monopolies that you can have, of course, and in the content media business, whoever makes Game of Thrones has the right to make Game of Thrones forever and profit from it forever. And the same is true of books. Well, not forever, but 75 years, which is might as well be forever. And that's true in books. And so Amazon was correct to point out that its adversary at the time, Macmillan, was exercising its monopoly rights. But really, there is another kind of monopoly, and it's one that Amazon has, which is a monopoly on the attention of the customer. And Macmillan got into this fight. There were others who were cheering them on from inside the publishing industry precisely because they knew that Amazon was building a monopoly of customer attention, even if they didn't know what words to give it. And the fact is Amazon still has that attention, and they've used Alexa to make sure that you direct that attention to them 10, 20 times a day instead of once or twice a week. And it has been the winning strategy. And as we talk more about people's anger towards Amazon for different things, you can't overcome the fact that for tens of millions of customers, they're just not going to care because Amazon has their attention.
What kind of an inflection did that capitulation on the ebook price put on the development of ebooks, which has sort of surprised me? I thought that by now, 11 years out, we'd be closer to 50% of people reading on ebooks, and I think it changes by genre, but it's probably more like 30. Do you think that step up in the price of ebooks really affected that, or we would have reached this kind of a equilibrium anyway?
Yeah, the equilibrium is more a function of how important reading is to some people. And for those of us for whom it's very, very important, ebooks are just the most convenient way to do it. But we are a minority of the population. About 20% of people you can really consider avid readers. That is, they read and buy 6 books a year. And then some of us, I have friends who read a book a week. And I don't have time for that. I wish I did. But that just shows you there's a difference in the world of people who love books and people for whom books, they can take it or leave it. So it's yes, for those of us who do this, we're using ebooks all the time, and some of us also read print, and some of us also listen to audiobooks, as I do. I do all three continuously. But for the person who's only going to read 1 or 2 books a year, figuring out which app that is, or getting used to the brightness on the screen, and figuring out how to bookmark pages, it's just probably not even worth their while. And so there's still plenty of time in people's lives to use old print books.
Well, let's go to HQ2. As usual, you had some prescience in your discussion of HQ2 almost a year ago because you mentioned Nashville, and they ended up getting kind of a consolation prize of 5,000 jobs for an excellence center. But what do you think of the way Amazon handled that whole rollout and their eventual choice of New York City and Northern Virginia?
Yeah, I wouldn't have predicted the outcome. I wouldn't have predicted splitting it into two headquarters, and I wouldn't have predicted the locations, to be honest. What I didn't understand, and I think is clear now, is that the degree to which just having a big pool of talent matters. And talent is very specific talent. I'm sure there's lovely talented people all across the country, but when you need to hire 10,000 people who are very adept at software, there's only a few places where you can do that. And if you go to somewhere like Nashville, they say, well, we have that many. But the answer is, yeah, you do, but you also have other companies that need them. And so basically Amazon would be coming in and taking up 80% of the market of developers, local developers. Whereas if in a place like Seattle, there are plenty of other developers there, thanks to the long history of Microsoft. And obviously New York is another place like that. Crystal City, a little more surprising, but and you add up the numbers, and you consider the importance of Amazon needing to be close to the federal government in the future, and at least makes a little more sense. The criticism of going from one HQ2 to HQ 2.1 and 2.2, or however you want to call it, to tease a little bit. That decision, I think they could have foreseen that was likely. But, are they obligated to tell everyone that that's what they want to do, or do they want to give everyone their best shot at 50,000 employees? I don't know. This whole thing, I remember when I was doing my MBA in the early 90s, it was right after South Carolina, the town of Greenville, had given the first BMW manufacturing plant in North America, massive breaks to build its facility. A facility still runs, although under Trump's new rules, who knows how that's going to work out, because some of that gets classified as foreign-made material, even though it's U.S.-made. It's very interesting. But the point is that town has really benefited from BMW moving there, even though the town gave a ton away. And so when people start pulling up different economic analyses and say, well, the state gave away this much, you can agree or disagree with that on a basis of policy, but empirically there's really no good way to measure whether the dollar value of the incentives was lesser or greater than the ultimate benefits, because already people who are living in neighborhoods that are going to be affected by these headquarters are already going to benefit. The property values go up, the tightening of the labor pool drives everybody's wages up, benefits go up. And it's really impossible to quantify whether that's ultimately a positive or a negative in the long run. I personally think it's a positive, but I also think it's a positive that New York didn't need to sacrifice so much to get. If talent really mattered that much, Amazon would have come there anyway. And, ironically, Google just announced that they were adding some other, 5 or 10,000 jobs in New York without any incentives at all. So I think there will be some negative sentiment directed towards Amazon for years to come on this topic, and maybe they should have foreseen that and avoided some of it.
I saw recently, actually, it's a podcast I listened to, that the latest estimate of the number of people at Amazon working on Alexa is 10,000, and that's probably more than the combined workforce on voice assistants at all of their competitors. Yep. What do you think those people are working on, and what should they be working on?
Next two things that have to happen. Number one, language processing has to become natural. And that just means that I should be able to say something that I want to Alexa, and she should figure out how to translate that into commands rather than me having to memorize different commands. And there's just some obvious amount of decoding what I've said to match certain historical behaviors of mine, or even things she said. So we have the Echo Show, a couple of them, and it routinely shows you news stories. And underneath it, it gives you the language. It says, to learn more about this, say, Alexa, tell me about the United Nations story. You can say that word for word. and she can come back and say, I'm not sure I know a story about the United Nations. Or if you vary it slightly, there's no way she's going to understand what you're talking. And you think, okay, there's got to be some pattern matching there. You showed me this story. You should presume that the 5 most likely things I'm going to say, one of them is this. And you should, you hear United, you should assume he's not talking about the airline. He's talking about the United Nations story that I just showed him. And with my camera, I can verify his eyes were looking at me. I mean, that level of obvious kind of natural interaction, that's what needs to happen first. Then, and so that's going to take a lot of people and a lot of time because it is very, very challenging. And the second thing needs to be, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but we shouldn't underestimate the power of this step change when Amazon moves into a anticipatory relationship with you, where Alexa volunteers things she thinks you need or are about to ask for, notices patterns. And I mean, I'll just give you easy ones and you'll think, well, that's not going to revolutionize my world. But the easy example doesn't revolutionize your world. But the ability to do the easy example means they can do all kinds of other harder ones. And the easy example is just something like, hey, every 3 weeks or so, you ask me for printer paper or cocoa powder or whatever it is. And it's been 3 weeks and you haven't asked yet. Do you want me to order that for you? Sure, that's simple when it comes to ordering things, but it turns out to be a lot simpler for other things, especially if you've let Alexa see your calendar, which my work calendar for security reasons isn't available to Alexa, which is incredibly frustrating to me because I want her to tell me when my next meeting is. I want her to tell me how much time I have to get to somewhere based on what's in my calendar. And Google can do that, of course, so I'm not suggesting that Amazon's the only one that can do that. But since Alexa is already the partner that our family has chosen to help us get our daily tasks done, I would love for Alexa to look at my calendar and say, hey, I think you're going to be in San Francisco next week. Does that mean you want me to order you an Uber? Oh, I'm looking at your flight on the calendar, and it looks like you're going to need an Uber 2 hours before. Unless you tell me something otherwise, that's what I'll plan on. And just that sort of the kind of thing that if you were a big boss and had a secretary that came in every morning back in the 1960s and said, okay, Mr. Edgerly, here's your day's plan. And that's what Alexa should do. Only half of those things, Alexa won't even need to confirm with you. She'll just take care of them. That's going to be huge. There's probably 8,000 of those 10,000 people are working on anticipatory experiences like that. And that will leave the competition in the dust. And, when I talked earlier about Amazon having a monopoly on your attention, that just locks that monopoly in place.
We talked earlier about the proliferation of devices, and I couldn't even remember the name of the Echo show or the spot when it came out. And you had expressed concern that the unified message of what is Alexa about was getting muddied by all these things compared with the clarity that Jobs always had at Apple. This is what we're doing for you, and here's the thing. Do you think they've managed to coalesce any more in the past year as to a point? What is this thing good for?
I think the customers have done that for them. I think essentially the customers are doubling down on the Echo Dot. And so that's where you're seeing, investment in improving Echo Dot, make the speaker better, make the Bluetooth better, because that appears to be the hotcake seller out there. And so I think the customer has said, oh, yeah, I see 100 ecosystem partners that are putting Alexa in all these different devices. But in the end, Alexa is that circle that sits in my living room. And I really think that's probably good for Amazon in the midterm, even though they want to encourage that ecosystem. I mean, there's a new smart home integration device that replaces your light switch with an Alexa and has a little screen, and you can still use it like a light switch by touching your finger on it on the screen, but it also gives you Alexa, and in theory, you could put that in every room in your home, which I've been writing about for a long time. Is certainly the way Alexa ends up. Is Alexa's in every room in your home. So, but if I were Amazon, I wouldn't be going out and telling the world, "Hey, we have an ecosystem partner that can put Alexa in your light switch," because the first thing the customer is going to do is like, "Was that really Alexa? If it's in your light switch, I'm not sure I get that. What does that mean? Why in your light switch?" Just let the customer think, "Oh, you mean the Echo Dot? That's what you mean. Okay, I'm going to get more of those."
Did you order an Amazon Basics Alexa-enabled microwave for $60?
I did not. Honestly, though, it's the kind of thing, if I had a space where I could put one, I would. I have wanted the microwave. Back in the days, I have wanted a microwave that has a good user experience for many, many years, and I have been able to use it in my professional career to talk about improving user experience and talk about how the microwave is absolutely one of the least improved things over the last 30 years. And so when they announced that and everyone was teasing about it, I was like, you know what? Pick the low-hanging fruit. Pick the thing that no one has improved in 30 years and make it work. Because how many times do you know, I just want that in there for 50 seconds. So you hit the minute button and you walk away and you leave it in there for 10 more seconds. Well, just being able to say, Alexa, cook this for 50 seconds and walk away is pretty nice.
Yeah, and there's all these things. I mean, I always feel stupid in front of my microwave because I know that I can do popcorn, I can do soup. There's all these specific tasks, and now I'm just going to be able to say, Alexa, warm up my coffee.
Exactly.
Yeah. New fun skill or useful skill in your family that you've plucked out of the, what is there now, 30 or 40,000 of them available for Alexa?
Many, many thousands. I have a friend who really got into some of the competitive games that you can play with other users across the world. And there's a word definition one, and which I played, but I don't even remember what it's called because I didn't get into it totally. And then there's a geography one, which is countries of the world, and it's set up as a mystery. And again, I can't remember what it's called. It's terrible of me, but it's a really interesting idea that you could use Alexa not just to get things done, but to technically connect to strangers around the world who have a shared interest in geography.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say I'm the right personality type for that, but I like I said, I had this friend who plays the word definition version of the game and just loves it, plays it every day, and just gets a thrill off of beating someone. And the amazing thing is the way the game works is it slots in a competitor who is more or less at your level. So you're always being challenged, no matter how good you get. And he likes, of course, I think that make sure you occasionally get someone you can beat for sure, just to keep you coming back. But,
they'd vary it.
They'd have to.
Whole Foods, anything surprised you in the last year on the integration of Whole Foods, missteps, things that turned out better than expected?
Well, that's a great question to put it that way. I would say we knew this was going to be rocky. I knew there would be labor issues. We knew there'd be questions of politics because Whole Foods is very progressive, and so is its employee base. And then you've got this company that's sending out plastic packaging and cardboard boxes by the millions. So I actually expected more friction in that regard. I expected more employees kind of revolting. I show up at my local Whole Foods and they're the ones asking me whether I'm Amazon Prime, and they're telling me, look, if you scan Amazon Prime here, you're going to be able to get a discount, or you'll get these paleo cheese puffs at a cheaper price. Yes, I did in fact buy paleo cheese puffs at Whole Foods.
I'll have a link to that.
Yeah, which says volumes about me and about them. Anyway, so I guess I've been surprised that it didn't go worse than it has. I still think there's a huge opportunity there that they will need to make clear to the customer who's a customer of both brands. And I mean, already the discounts are pretty significant and pretty regular, and you get notified by Whole Foods, hey, because you're Prime, you're going to get this extra bonus. So I think they're moving in the right direction on it, and because maybe they went slowly because they wanted to avoid big backlash. Who knows? But I don't think there has been a If you go to the liberal press, the liberal progressive press, then yes, there's a huge backlash. They feel like the world has come to an end, and Amazon is the devil himself. But they felt that anyway before the acquisition, so I don't know that that's an audience Amazon cared to appease much, but. But I think in general, there hasn't been as much backlash as I might have expected.
The other pieces of the physical stores, I think there are now 18 Amazon bookstores. Now there's several Amazon Go stores, and then this new 4-star stores. Can you put those pieces together and see what they're doing strategically in the physical store space?
What it tells me is they have a very decentralized and experimental model at Amazon, that they're willing to try all these different paths simultaneously. And I'll say, I mean, part of my work is to teach companies how to be experimental and engage in the principles of what people loosely call design thinking. And they're doing it. So, I have to give them credit for that. The idea of experimentation, though, is that you are going to do things that fail. And Amazon has been comfortable failing. Of course, they failed on the phone. They failed in a couple other categories they tried to get into, famously, like automotive in the year 2000. I still remember that one. But really, they're failures now because regulators are watching, because the press has their eye trained on them so much. It's a little harder to endure failure now than maybe it was even 5 years ago. Once you become a $1 trillion valued company on the stock market, a lot of people are gunning for you. So in the one hand, it's good that they're still willing to experiment, because I think the tendency might be to go a little more conservative. On the other hand, it just means they're opening themselves up to a lot of criticism. When one of these doesn't work, when it fails, everyone's going to say, the company's lost its mojo, And then when Bezos comes out and says, someday Amazon will fall, that everyone starts saying, and it's tomorrow. He didn't mean it was tomorrow. He meant it like, let's make sure this never happens. But that's certainly the way his detractors would love to interpret that.
If you were a retailer, either say a small independent retailer or Walmart, and you saw this experimental mode coming in from so many different directions, what strategies would you recommend to survive whatever Amazon's going to be throwing at you?
Nimble store formats. I mean, that's really the answer here. We're seeing Macy's cut back on its footprints. They're just walling off entire sections of the store and saying, this is no longer part of our store. And that's for financial reasons, but it also creates a kind of agility. I remember Barnes & Noble, one of its strengths in the early 2000s was that it had some of the most loosely structured retail contracts for floor space in the business, and that allowed them to expand. In their early days, it was because they needed to expand quickly from time to time, and add a coffee shop and that kind of thing. But it also gave them the latitude to shrink quickly, and that was good. I can't comment on whether they used that particularly well, given that they were facing other challenges in the last 10 years. But I'd say if I'm, grocery store, if I'm department store, or I'm mid-sized retailer, I'm looking at how can I configure my store experience differently, rapidly, so that I can get smaller if I need to, so that I can add a section of the store that does self-checkout in an automated way as that technology becomes cheaper. I'd also have an entire team that does nothing but go around the country and shop at these stores that Amazon is experimenting with, and just, case every inch of the place and figure out how they're squeezing value out of that footprint.
The Microsoft partnership has been interesting. I saw today that Microsoft is now selling Echo smart speakers in its Microsoft stores, and you can do Cortana with your Echo and vice versa. What do you think's going on there?
Microsoft has basically thrown in the towel on having a direct relationship with end consumers. I mean, they have Office 365. That's really the relationship that they still have. They're trying to get back the browser game, and they are the second best browser in major markets. So that's good. But the real story is that they understand that this voice thing is happening without them. I can't imagine there's a high percent of people who have turned their Echoes to Cortana mode. It's going to be small. And they're going to be like the people who are on Firefox as a browser. Like, I'm the 5% who refuse to go along with the big guys. That's fine. I think in Amazon's business, or in Microsoft's business, the real value to them of their ongoing relationship with Amazon is they can be relevant to that customer, so that when that customer is making business decisions about having Microsoft Office and having Outlook for business, they prefer it and they like it and they feel comfortable with it. Because there are people who aren't comfortable with Google and Gmail in the office. They feel like Google and Gmail is fine for me as a consumer, but if it's in the office, then I'm forced to submit all this data to Google, even though that's technically not what's happening in Google for Business. But so I think Microsoft's trying to make sure that they still have a business to business relationship. In order to do that, they have to make sure consumers haven't forgotten who they are.
Last time we talked, I always enjoy asking you what books have had an impact on you. You were reading the third book of Way of Kings, and then Robert Sapolsky's Behave. What's top of mind on your nighttime book stand these days?
Yeah. So, too many to choose from, actually. I have been rereading, and I'm going to plug this book. It's the 20th anniversary of Virginia Postrel's The Future and Its Enemies.
It was written 20 years ago?
20 years ago, 1998, she published it. At the time, she was the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, and just a very, very sharp writer and observer of her time. And at that time, if you remember, 1998, we didn't have any of this social media. We didn't have any conversations like this, but there was still already a thriving conversation thanks to the CEO of Sun, who wrote a big piece in Wired about privacy. And there were already people who were foreseeing this interconnectedness that we have today in the internet would have negative externalities, that businesses would be failing thanks to new competitors. No one could say for sure that Amazon was going to be the reason a lot of these businesses would go out. Although if you read my research from 1999, a year later, we called it. But, she was writing at a very early age. But instead of trying to pick out winners and losers and pick sides, she stepped back and wrote a piece where she observed, what is your default tendency to believe about the future? Do you believe that the future is something that has to be controlled, subjugated, harnessed, maybe even prevented? Or do you believe that the future is something that somehow keeps unfolding in ways that we can take advantage of, that will potentially benefit humanity? And when you look back in history, you can make the argument either way, except if you're a Steven Pinker reader, as I am, on balance, it's better, not worse. Mm-hmm. And so you go back and you read Virginia Postrel's book, and you realize that she saw this thing she called dynamism versus stacism, or being a statist versus a dynamist. And maybe the terms, looking back on it, didn't capture it perfectly. But the concept sure did, because she would say it didn't matter whether you were right or left. The people who want to shut down the future, want to control it, regulate it, and subjugate it, right or left, doesn't matter. They're the statists. They want things to only proceed according to a known plan. Well, heaven knows, the last 20 years, nothing has proceeded according to a known plan. Steve Jobs didn't even know that the most important thing in the iPhone was going to be the App Store. They sued their customers for the first year when they tried to jailbreak the phone and put their own apps on it. They sued them. And then they realized, wait a minute, this is the future. So even Steve Jobs did not see the future of his own devices. He's the guy who famously said, we'll never make a large screen phone because that's ridiculous to carry that around in your pocket. And we'll never make a small tablet because then you'd have to, he said, shave your finger down like a pencil in order to use it. It'd be so small, which never mind the contradiction in terms that the iPhone had a smaller screen. So nobody can see the future. But what we can see from the past is that it unfolds according to certain properties. And what she wrote that was so compelling was that the best properties to help that unfold in the best way are properties of experimentation, of testing, of openness, of collaboration, of letting people try what people do in an environment where they get feedback from the marketplace and then they can respond. Well, that's essentially, when I wrote Digital Disruption 5 years ago, that's essentially what I was saying made digital disruption possible. It wasn't the technology. It was the ability to use the technology to propose an idea, test it, develop it, prototype it, get it out in front of people and find out if they like it or not. That's where Kickstarter thrives, is in that margin where someone says, I have an idea and this idea could change the world. And sometimes it does, and most of the time it doesn't. But if you go back in time, or you go to, say, North Korea, and someone says, I have an idea, and the state says, well, we don't see the ramifications of that idea. We can't control it, so you can't even test it. In fact, you can't talk about it. That's the world that I still think there are people who would prefer to live in that world in our country today. And they don't realize it. They don't realize that's a personality flaw on their part. And instead, and we see these editorials in newspapers all the time, the unforeseen consequences of Amazon. That was a piece in the Wall Street Journal recently. And you see those pieces and you say, this is a personality issue. You're not accurately describing the past or the future. You're describing your personality for us. And you're saying, I'm uncomfortable with the world unfolding in a direction that I didn't personally foresee and verify and approve of. And so therefore it shan't happen. And I don't have a lot of patience for that. And in my work, obviously, you can tell I love the future. And sometimes I guess it right, and sometimes I get it wrong. I think I get it right in ways that are meaningful. But what I do know, the reason I get it right is I look for the connection between the idea that the entrepreneur has and the value that the customer could get out of it. And I allow the market to let those two communicate with each other. And then the things that fail, and the things that succeed do so because, hey, you did the right thing for the customer. That's where I come from. Now, it's some people will probably be upset right now listening to this, but read Virginia's book, and I think you'll be impressed. It's not on Audible, but it is on ebook. So I was planning to just listen to it, but because this was 20 years ago, there was no Audible, so it's never been recorded. So that's another interesting thing. It's like I'm choosing book format based on availability, based on what I'm hoping to do with it, when I'm going to read it. There are some books that I have to have in print because I need to go back and look for details and footnotes and things. And this was one that I thought I'd just listen to, but can't.
How about your next book? 5 years since the last one. You got anything germinating that might break forth in the next few years?
Well, you may have noticed I have some passion in my voice when I talk about whether or not we have the personality characteristics that will help us participate in the future. And I don't do that to just say, hey, there's good personalities out there that I like, and then there's bad ones that I want to shut down. I actually believe that we have, and the science backs me up on this, that we have more control over our personality traits than most people presume, but we tend to be locked in based on the health of our physical bodies, the social and psychological environments that we grew up in and continue to live in. We tend to be locked into certain personality traits. So actually at Forrester, we're writing a piece right now. I've been spending the last year doing some research behind closed doors on something I call FutureFitness. And FutureFitness is this really quite simple survey tool that I've developed that allows me to predict pretty accurately whether you have all of those traits in common that you need to be actively participating in the future versus being dragged along behind. And the 9 things that FutureFitness predicts range all the way from physical health to emotional health to social cooperativeness and then, of course, attitudes towards the benefits of technology. And it's remarkably predictive. And so my goal, we're going to release this. We're letting our clients know, hey, you may have employees who are more future fit than your competitors' employees. And if not, let's help them get there. But then we're hoping to turn that outward. For the first time, Forrester will be inviting average people who aren't clients from big corporations or small corporations to take this survey, measure their future fitness, and then we're going to try to guide them to resources that might help them become more future fit, because we believe future fitness will be necessary for everyone. Just like if you go back 100 years ago, there were people who resisted having electricity. Well, now we all have it. Today, there are people who resist talking to machines, not just 100 years, but 10 years from now, everyone will talk to machines. The question is, will they do so with an edge in their voice, or will they do so knowing how to talk to those machines in a way that gets them what they want rather than what the machine overlords might want? So future fitness is going to be a big focus of mine, and we're trying to decide whether it's a book or not that will help people read it and say, okay, well, here's what I do based on my score. How do I improve my fitness so that I can shape the future, not just go along for the ride?
It sounds to me to make a good app for Alexa.
In fact, we do think it would be. We're just going to see what's the right next step for us. Serving individual consumers is not really the business that we're in, but it's a business I think I want to be in. So I'm trying to gently lead my own company in that direction, and we'll see what that materializes into.
I've been speaking with James McQuivey, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Thanks very much, James.
Great to talk to you, Len.
In content, I want to pass along a recommendation from listener Chris Kentucky. hope I'm pronouncing that right. Chris has been listening a long time, since the Kindle DX, and he sent me a link to an interview with U.S. Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska, who in October published a book titled Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. I've heard of this book, but I haven't read it yet, and the Times question and answer session with Sasse is full of pearls that make me understand why Chris recommended that I try to book him for an interview on the show. I'll definitely do that. Here's one example of what he had to say in this interview. The question was, what's the most interesting thing you learned from a book recently? And the senator's answer was, I'm currently obsessed with how fast our understanding of the human brain is changing. There's a Moore's law in terms of neurological imaging. What we're learning about the brain, and especially about the frontal lobe of teenagers, is doubling every 18 to 24 months now. Most of what I'm learning in this space is coming from articles and meetings with neurological researchers, but some scholars are starting to write important books on the so what's of bathing our brains in too much technology. Right now, my favorite work in this space is Cal Newport's Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World. Interesting story. He homeschools his children with his wife, and a huge emphasis on books and trying to develop a real reading habit among his kids. They're working on creating a bookshelf of the family canon, that they're carefully choosing books that they agree as a family are important to read. So I do hope I can book him for a future conversation here at the podcast. Also on content, I'll give you some of my first impressions of my second reading of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I did hear about that on the show last week in my interview with Chris Schloop. It's a powerful book, you know. I bet all of us who ever read that book remember the opening line, "Call me Ishmael." And I'm just to the point where Ishmael has made his way to New Bedford, and he's about to try to get to Nantucket to leave on a whaling ship. And he's staying in New Bedford in a kind of a seedy inn, and the only bed available is one that he's going to have to share with a harpooner. And I didn't remember from reading the book back in high school as to who this harpooner turns out to be, but the dread and the suspense of seeing this person show up in the dark and knowing that he's going to have to share a bed with him. And it turns out to be Queequeg, who's a major character in the book. I do remember that name. In thinking back on why my memory of Moby Dick is so conflicted at best, I'm starting to have a sense of it. It's really slow going. To get the benefit of reading this book, I'm reading it in, meditative reading snippets as I'm falling to sleep on my Kindle Oasis, and I'm letting myself just enjoy the sentences, and I'm going back over sections that I don't understand, and I'm following links to pick up terms. So I'm really just acting as if I have all the time in the world to enjoy this book, and it's probably going to take me a year to finish it at this rate. When I was in high school, I was a pretty eager Beaver student, and I was the head of the student newspaper and just doing all kinds of stuff that I thought was probably going to help me to get into the college of my choice, which was Harvard. And I can imagine as an 18-year-old, and at that point it wasn't on a Kindle, it was a paper book, this great big fat book that Mr. Duncan was expecting us to plow through mindfully over the course of several weeks when we were dealing with it. And I can just imagine thinking, I just don't have time to give this what it deserves. I have the box of some of my schoolwork from college and Belmont Hill here that we retrieved from my parents' home, and I think I might try to go through there and see if I can find a paper that I wrote about Moby Dick and see what kind of a grade I got in a comment from Mr. Duncan. It may well turn that Mr. Duncan had a comment about my understanding of Moby Dick, which left a sort of more bitter than sweet memory. But I'm glad to have started rereading it, and every once in a while I'll maybe share you some observations from the hunt for the great white whale. That's it for this week. I don't have a guest lined up next week, and you might be able to help me out for that show that I'm going to be bringing to you from the road out west. I'm thinking of an AMA. That's Ask Me Anything. Those are sessions I think Reddit has done over the years. So the idea would be if you email me a question or just something that's on your mind that I could talk about, I'll spend some time on next week's show trying to answer or comment. And if you want to leave a brief audio file, so much the better. I can't guarantee that she will participate, but if you have a question for my wife, Darlene, I will pass it along, and depending on what else is going on the trip, she might be able to weigh in as well. So we'll try this as an experiment. It may end up taking more time to put together that kind of a show than the traditional format, but since I don't have anything scheduled yet and we leave at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning, I thought this might be a way to make a plan for next week's show. In the Fitness for the Future mode, of course, I loved hearing James talk about that. I have a new robot named Vector, and this is the successor to an Anki robot named Cosmo that I've been experimenting with. And I knew that this was coming out of a really advanced robotics school at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and they have upped the stakes with this new version. It looks very similar to Cosmo, but this one has a color screen, and there's AI built into it, and the promise of having it hook up with Alexa sometime, I think, early next year. He just wanders around my desk making squeaky little noises, not falling off the edge. When I say, "Who am I?" he sometimes knows who I am. Otherwise, he says, "Have I met you?" And some quite playful robot interactions coming from this new guy. Today and every day, I'm grateful that you are listening. Have a good one. Bye.